The mahogany conference table gleamed under the soft lighting of Patterson and Associates law firm as Eleanor Blackwood clutched her designer handbag, her lips curved in a satisfied smirk. She thought she finally had the ammunition to destroy the woman who had stolen her precious son. But as attorney Marcus Patterson shuffled through the thick stack of legal documents, Eleanor had no idea she was about to witness the most shocking revelation of her 73 years. One that would shatter every assumption she'd made about her daughter-in-law and leave her scrambling to salvage what remained of her family relationships. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of the modest two-bedroom apartment in downtown Seattle as Rebecca Martinez-Blackwood carefully folded her husband's dress uniform. The navy dress blues, still faintly of the cedar chest where they'd been stored since David's funeral 8 months ago. Her fingers traced the ribbons and medals, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Navy Cross, each one representing a piece of the man she'd loved and lost too soon. At 28, Rebecca had already experienced more grief than most people twice her age. David Blackwood had been her anchor, her protector, and her greatest love. They'd met during her final year of nursing school when he was on leave from his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. What started as a chance encounter at a coffee shop near the naval base had blossomed into a whirlwind romance that lasted just 18 months before an IED took him from her forever. Rebecca had been working double shifts at Seattle General Hospital, trying to keep herself busy and pay off the mounting medical bills from David's final months. The military had covered most of his care, but there were always extras, things she'd insisted on to make him more comfortable, experimental treatments she'd researched during sleepless nights, hoping against hope for a miracle that never came. The apartment felt impossibly empty without David's booming laugh, echoing from the kitchen where he'd attempt to cook elaborate meals that usually ended in disaster. He'd been the eternal optimist, always planning their future together, the house they'd buy, the children they'd have, the places they'd travel when his service was complete. Rebecca had kept all his notebooks, filled with his careful handwriting mapping out their dreams. What made the loneliness worse was the growing hostility from David's family, particularly his mother, Eleanor. From the moment David had brought Rebecca home to meet his parents, Eleanor had made her disapproval crystal clear. It started with subtle comments about Rebecca's background. Her parents were hard-working immigrants from Mexico who ran a small restaurant in Tacoma. Eleanor would make pointed remarks about cultural differences and question whether Rebecca truly understood the responsibilities of being married to a Blackwood. The Blackwood family had old money, the kind that came with a sprawling estate in Bellevue, multiple properties, and a name that appeared on hospital wings and university buildings throughout Washington state. Eleanor had married into the family 45 years ago and had spent decades cultivating the image of refined society matron. She served on charity boards, hosted elaborate fundraisers, and spoke frequently about maintaining family tradition. David had been Eleanor's golden child, her only son among 3 daughters. She'd planned his entire life, the right schools, the right career, and certainly the right wife. Rebecca, with her student loans and night shifts, definitely wasn't what Eleanor had envisioned for her precious boy. The tensions had come to a head during David's final weeks. As he lay dying in the hospital, Eleanor had barely acknowledged Rebecca's presence. She'd brought in specialists, insisted on private rooms, and made medical decisions without consulting Rebecca, despite her being David's wife and a trained nurse. Eleanor had even suggested that Rebecca was emotionally unstable and perhaps not the best person to make decisions about David's care. After the funeral, Eleanor's coldness had turned to outright hostility. She'd contested Rebecca's right to certain military benefits, questioned her claim to David's personal effects, and had even suggested that Rebecca had somehow manipulated David into marriage. The accusations stung not just because they were false, but because Rebecca was too grief-stricken to defend herself properly. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago when Eleanor had called Rebecca directly. "I know what you are," Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You saw a vulnerable soldier with a family name and money, and you swooped in. You're nothing but a gold digger who got lucky." Rebecca had been too shocked to respond. The accusation was so far from the truth that she'd simply hung up, her hands shaking. She'd fallen in love with David's humor, his kindness, his unwavering dedication to serving his country. She'd never even known about the family wealth until months into their relationship, and it had made her uncomfortable rather than excited. Now, as Rebecca prepared for what she assumed would be a simple reading of David's will, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Eleanor had insisted on being present, claiming she needed to protect the family's interest. Rebecca had agreed, hoping it might be an opportunity to finally bridge the gap between them for David's sake. The law office of Patterson and Associates was located in one of Seattle's most prestigious buildings, its marble lobby and crystal chandeliers, speaking to the type of clientele they typically serve. Rebecca felt underdressed in her simple black dress and cardigan, especially compared to Eleanor's designer suit and perfectly styled silver hair. As they sat in the waiting room, Eleanor had made several pointed comments about the inappropriate nature of Rebecca's presence. "I don't understand why you need to be here," she'd said loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "Surely David's family matters should be handled by actual family members." Rebecca had bitten her tongue, choosing instead to focus on the framed photo of David in his dress uniform that she carried in her purse. He'd been so proud of his service, so dedicated to protecting others. She wondered what he would think about his mother's behavior, about the way grief had turned what should have been a united family into adversaries. The weight of the past 8 months pressed down on Rebecca's shoulders as she waited. She'd been David's wife for barely a year before losing him, and now she faced the possibility of losing even his memory if Eleanor succeeded in erasing her from the family narrative. All she wanted was to honor David's memory and find a way to move forward with her life, but Eleanor seemed determined to make even that impossible. As the clock ticked toward their appointment time, Rebecca said a silent prayer for strength. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything she thought she knew about her late husband's family would be turned upside down, and Eleanor's carefully constructed world would come crashing down around her. The receptionist's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Patterson will see you now." Both women stood simultaneously, and for a moment, Rebecca wondered if Eleanor would try to exclude her from the meeting entirely. But the older woman simply straightened her pearls and walked toward the conference room with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way. Marcus Patterson was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His law firm had been handling the Blackwood family's legal affairs for over 30 years, and he'd known David since he was a boy. As they entered the mahogany-paneled conference room, Rebecca noticed the way his expression tightened slightly when he saw Eleanor's cold demeanor. "Please have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the chairs around the polished table. Eleanor immediately claimed the seat at the head of the table, as if asserting her dominance over the proceedings. Rebecca quietly took a chair across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "Before we begin," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to controlling every situation, "I want to make something perfectly clear." She turned her steely gaze toward Rebecca. "I've been patient with this charade long enough, but I won't stand by and watch my son's memory be dishonored by someone who married him for his money." Rebecca felt her cheeks flush with humiliation. "Mrs. Blackwood, I never—" "Don't interrupt me," Eleanor snapped. "I've done my research. I know exactly what you are. A nurse from a working-class family, who saw an opportunity and took it. You probably calculated exactly how much David was worth before you even said 'I do.'" Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss No Blackwood, perhaps we should proceed with the reading of the will rather than." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This needs to be said. David was vulnerable when he met her. He was dealing with the trauma of war, and she took advantage of it. She love-bombed him, convinced him to marry her quickly before he could think clearly." Eleanor's voice grew more venomous with each word. "I've seen women like you before, gold diggers who prey on military men because they know these boys are trained to be loyal and protective." Rebecca's hands trembled in her lap. Each word felt like a physical blow, not just because of the cruelty, but because of how wrong they all were. She thought about David's proposal, how nervous he'd been, how he'd apologized for not being able to afford a bigger ring. She'd told him she would have married him with a twist tie around her finger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Rebecca said quietly, finding her voice despite the tears threatening to spill. I loved David. I would have loved him if he'd been a janitor or a billionaire. His money never mattered to me. Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Oh please, you expect me to believe that? You, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, just happened to fall in love with a Blackwood. Do you think I was born yesterday? Miss Blackwood, Marcus interjected more firmly. I really think we should focus on. Let me finish, Eleanor demanded. I've been doing some digging into your background, Rebecca. Your parents' restaurant is failing, isn't it? Your nursing school loans are substantial. You've been living paycheck to paycheck your entire adult life, and then suddenly, you meet my son, and all your problems are solved. Rebecca's heart pounded. It was true that her parents' restaurant had struggled, especially during the pandemic. And yes, her student loans were significant, but none of that had anything to do with why she'd fallen in love with David. I've also been in touch with some of David's military friends, Eleanor continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. They told me interesting things about how quickly you moved in with him, how you were always asking questions about his family, his background. You did your homework, didn't you? That's not, Rebecca started, but Eleanor held up a perfectly manicured hand. I'm not finished. I know about the expensive treatments you insisted on during his final weeks. Treatments that weren't covered by military insurance. Very convenient that you were there to help him make those decisions, wasn't it? Racking up bills that you knew would be paid by the family estate. Rebecca felt sick. Those treatments had been her desperate attempt to save the man she loved. She'd researched every possible option, consulted with specialists, refused to give up hope even when the doctors had suggested hospice care. The idea that Eleanor saw this as some sort of financial scheme was horrifying. You're wrong about everything, Rebecca said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. I didn't even know about David's family money until months after we were together. When he first told me, I was intimidated, not excited. I was worried his family would think exactly what you're thinking now. And you were right to worry, Eleanor replied coldly, because I can see right through you. You're a calculating little gold digger who saw an opportunity and took it. You probably thought you'd hit the jackpot when you found out about David's trust fund. What trust fund? Rebecca asked, genuinely confused. Eleanor's smile was predatory. Oh, don't play dumb. The trust fund that his grandfather established, the one that was supposed to support David and his future family, the one that you've been counting on, no doubt. Rebecca stared at her mother-in-law in genuine bewilderment. David had never mentioned any trust fund. In fact, he'd been careful about money, always budgeting, always conscious of their expenses. If he'd had access to significant funds, why had he been so worried about affording their small wedding? Why had he insisted on a modest apartment, instead of something nice? I don't know what you're talking about, Rebecca said honestly. David never mentioned any trust fund. Right, Eleanor said sarcastically. I'm sure that's what you'll claim in court when you try to get your hands on family money that doesn't belong to you, but I won't let that happen. I've already spoken to my attorney about contesting David's will if necessary. Marcus Patterson had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort. As the family's longtime attorney, he'd seen his share of family disputes, but this level of hostility was unusual. More importantly, he was privy to information that would make Eleanor's accusations seem not just wrong but spectacularly misguided. Mrs. Blackwood, Marcus said carefully, I really think we should proceed with the reading of the will. There are matters that need to be addressed. Eleanor waved him off dismissively. Fine, let's get this over with. But I want it on record that I believe this woman manipulated my son and has no rightful claim to Blackwood family assets. As Marcus began organizing the documents on the table, Rebecca felt a crushing weight of despair. Even if the will reading went smoothly, how could she ever have a relationship with David's family after this? Eleanor's accusations had been so vicious, so personal, that Rebecca couldn't imagine any path forward. What she didn't know was that David had been keeping secrets, not about his love for her, but about his own complicated relationship with his family's wealth. And those secrets were about to change everything. Marcus Patterson adjusted his glasses and opened the thick leather portfolio containing David's will. The room fell silent, except for the soft rustle of papers and the distant hum of Seattle traffic, 20 floors below. Rebecca could feel Eleanor's eyes boring into her, radiating contempt and barely contained triumph. "Before I begin the formal reading," Marcus said, his voice measured and professional, "I want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for everyone. David was a remarkable young man, and his loss has affected us all deeply." Eleanor's expression softened slightly at the mention of her son, but her gaze remained cold when it shifted back to Rebecca. "Yes, well, let's just get on with it, shall we? I'm sure we all have better things to do." Marcus nodded and began reading from the official document. "I, David Michael Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament." The legal language flowed in the familiar cadence that Rebecca had heard in countless movies and TV shows, but hearing it applied to her beloved husband made it feel surreal and final. As Marcus read through the preliminary sections, the revocation of previous wills, the appointment of executors, the standard legal protections, Rebecca found herself studying the grain of the mahogany table, trying to process that this was really happening. David was really gone, and they were dividing up the remnants of his life like pieces of a puzzle that would never be whole again. "To my beloved wife, Rebecca Martinez-Blackwood," Marcus continued, and Rebecca's attention snapped back to the present, "I leave my personal effects including my military medals, photographs and personal correspondence. I also leave her my collection of books, particularly the poetry volumes we read together during our courtship." Eleanor snorted softly. "Poetry? How romantic. I'm sure those are worth a fortune." Rebecca ignored the sarcasm, thinking instead of those quiet evenings when David would read Pablo Neruda to her in his surprisingly gentle voice. Those books were worth more to her than any amount of money. "I also leave to my wife the sum of $50,000 from my personal savings account, to help with any immediate expenses and to provide some financial security during her period of grief." $50,000. Rebecca blinked in surprise. She'd known David had some savings, but she'd never imagined it was that much. She'd been so focused on caring for him during his illness that they'd never discussed the details of his finances. Eleanor's laugh was brittle and mocking. $50,000. How generous. "I'm sure that's exactly what she was hoping for." "Mrs. Blackwood, please," Marcus said firmly. "There's more." "Of course there is," Eleanor replied, settling back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone about to watch an entertaining show. "Let me guess. She gets the apartment, maybe his car. I suppose every gold digger needs transportation." Rebecca felt her face burning with humiliation. Eleanor's cruelty seemed to know no bounds, and she was clearly enjoying every moment of this. The older woman had positioned herself as the wronged party, the protector of her son's memory, when in reality she was the one dishonoring everything David had stood for. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a strange note that made both women look at him more closely, "there's something else, something that I think will surprise both of you." Eleanor's eyebrows raised. "Oh? Don't tell me he left her the family silver too." "Miss Blackwood," Marcus said, setting down the will and picking up a different document, "before I continue, I need to share some information about David's financial situation that I don't think either of you fully understood." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharpening. "I mean that David was far wealthier than either of you realized, substantially wealthier." Rebecca frowned. "I don't understand. David was always so careful about money. We budgeted for everything. He worried about the cost of our wedding, our apartment." "That's because David chose to live that way," Marcus explained. "He made a conscious decision to live on his military salary and not touch his inheritance." "What inheritance?" Eleanor demanded. "David's trust fund doesn't mature until he's 35. He wouldn't have had access to that money yet." Marcus's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't think you understand the full scope of your son's financial situation. David inherited significantly more than just his grandfather's trust fund." Eleanor's confident expression began to waver. "That's impossible. I would have known about any other family money." "Not family money," Marcus said quietly. "David's biological father left him a substantial inheritance." The room went completely silent. Rebecca stared at Marcus in confusion, while Eleanor's face had gone pale. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor whispered. David's father died when he was 3 years old. There was no inheritance. That's not entirely accurate, Marcus said gently. David's biological father, Captain James Rodriguez, died in a training accident when David was 3, but Captain Rodriguez came from a very wealthy family, oil and real estate investments in Texas. When he died, he left everything to David. Rebecca felt the world tilting around her. Rodriguez? But David's last name is Blackwood, because Eleanor remarried when David was 4, Marcus explained. Her second husband, William Blackwood, adopted David and gave him his name, but David's biological father's inheritance was held in trust until he turned 20. Eleanor's hand went to her throat. That's impossible. I would have known. I would have been notified. You were, Marcus said, pulling out another document. I have copies of all the correspondence sent to your address over the years. David began receiving information about his inheritance when he turned 18, and he gained full access to it when he turned 21. How much money are we talking about? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus consulted his paper. The current value of David's inheritance from his biological father is approximately $47 million. Eleanor's face went white as a sheet. Rebecca felt like she might faint. 47 million. Eleanor repeated weakly. That's correct. And according to David's will, he's left the entirety of that inheritance to his wife Rebecca Martinez-Blackwood. The silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor stared at Marcus as if he were speaking a foreign language, while Rebecca tried to process what she'd just heard. $47 million. David had been a multi-millionaire, and he'd never said a word about it. But that's not even the most remarkable part, Marcus continued, his voice growing softer. David also left a sealed letter for his wife, with instructions that it should be read aloud in the presence of his family. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. A letter, yes, and given the circumstances of today's meeting, I think it's particularly relevant. As Marcus reached for the sealed envelope, Rebecca realized that everything she thought she knew about her husband, her marriage, and her place in the Blackwood family was about to change forever. Eleanor's accusations suddenly seemed not just wrong, but spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. The gold digger, it turned out, had just inherited a fortune she never knew existed. Marcus Patterson held the sealed envelope in his hands, the weight of it seeming to fill the entire conference room. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Rebecca felt as though she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body, unable to process the magnitude of what she'd just learned. Before I read David's letter, Marcus said gently, I want to explain something about your husband's character, Rebecca. In the 7 years since David gained access to his inheritance, he never spent a single dollar of it on himself. He lived entirely on his military salary, saved every penny he could, and invested the inheritance wisely. He often told me that he wanted to earn his own way in the world. Eleanor's voice cracked as she spoke. $47 million, and he never told me? He never told anyone except me. Marcus replied. He made me promise to keep it confidential until after his death. He said he wanted to live as the man he chose to be, not the man his money could make him. Rebecca's mind reeled as she thought about their modest wedding, their small apartment, David's careful budgeting. But why? Why would he hide something like that? I think his letter will explain better than I can, Marcus said, carefully opening the envelope. David wrote this 6 months before he died, during his final leave. He asked me to read it aloud, only if there were ever questions about his marriage or his wife's motivation. Eleanor's perfectly composed facade was crumbling. Her hands shook as she reached for her water glass, and Rebecca noticed that her lipstick had smudged slightly, the first crack in her armor of perfect presentation. Marcus unfolded the letter and began to read in David's familiar measured tone. If you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone, and it probably means that my mother has been giving Rebecca trouble. Mom, I love you, but I know how you think, and I know what you probably assume about my wife. Eleanor made a small choking sound, but Marcus continued. I need you to understand something about the woman I married. Rebecca Martinez has no idea about my inheritance. I've never told her about the money from my biological father, and I never planned to unless it became absolutely necessary. I wanted her to love me for who I am, not what I have. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. Even in death, David was protecting her, defending her against accusations she'd never seen coming. I tested her, Mom. I know that sounds terrible, but I had to be sure. I told her I was worried about affording our wedding. I insisted we live in a modest apartment. I made her split grocery bills with me. And do you know what she did? She offered to pay for our entire wedding with her nursing overtime money. She suggested we elope to save money. She brought home coupons and cooked simple meals because she thought I was struggling financially. Eleanor's face had gone completely white. She stared at the table, unable to meet Rebecca's eyes. The night I proposed, I apologized for the small ring. Rebecca looked at me like I was crazy. She said she would have said yes if I'd proposed with a ring from a gumball machine. She made me promise we'd never let money change who we were as a couple. Marcus paused, allowing the weight of David's words to settle over the room. Rebecca remembered that conversation, how she'd meant every word. The ring had been perfect because David had chosen it, not because of its size or cost. I watched her during my illness, Mom. I watched her research treatments, fight with insurance companies, and spend her own money on things to make me comfortable. She never once asked about my finances or my family's money. She mortgaged her future to care for me, working extra shifts to pay for things she thought I couldn't afford. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. She put her head in her hands, and Rebecca could see her shoulders shaking. Rebecca doesn't know this, but I've been watching her since my diagnosis. I changed my will 3 times, adding more money each time, because I realized that the woman I married deserves everything I have to give. She's not a gold digger, Mom. She's gold. Pure gold. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Eleanor's quiet sobbing. Rebecca stared at her hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's love and the vindication of his words. Marcus cleared his throat softly and continued reading. I'm leaving Rebecca my entire inheritance because she's the only person I've ever met who loved me despite my money. Not because of it. She's earned every penny through her selflessness, her dedication, and her pure heart. And Mom, if you're hearing this letter, it means you've probably accused her of being something she's not. I hope you'll apologize and try to build a relationship with the woman I love more than life itself. Eleanor lifted her head, her mascara streaked, her perfect image completely destroyed. For the first time since Rebecca had known her, she looked vulnerable and human. One more thing, Mom. Rebecca's parents' restaurant is struggling, and she's been sending them money from her nursing salary to help keep it afloat. She's been doing this for 2 years, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner. She never told me because she was embarrassed about her family's financial problems. That's the kind of woman I married, someone who sacrifices for the people she loves. Rebecca gasped. She'd thought she'd hidden her parents' financial struggles so well, but David had known, and he'd loved her even more for it. Please take care of her, Mom. She's going to need family now more than ever. And Rebecca, if you're hearing this, please forgive my mother. She loves me, and sometimes that love makes her protective to a fault. I love you both, and I hope you can find a way to love each other too. Marcus folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. The silence stretched between the 3 of them, heavy with revelation and regret. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice broken and small. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong about everything. Rebecca looked at her mother-in-law, really looked at her, and saw not the imperious society matron who'd tormented her, but a grieving mother who'd lost her son and nearly lost her daughter-in-law through her own prejudice and pain. We both lost him, Rebecca said softly. That's what matters now. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the conference room as the 3 of them sat in the aftermath of David's revelation. Marcus Patterson quietly gathered the legal documents, giving the 2 women time to process everything that had unfolded. The mahogany table that had earlier felt like a battlefield now seemed like sacred ground where truth had finally been spoken. Eleanor reached into her designer handbag with trembling hands, pulling out an expensive handkerchief to wipe away her smeared mascara. When she looked up at Rebecca, Her eyes were red-rimmed but clearer than they'd been in months. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than an apology, I owe you everything. I've been cruel and judgmental and absolutely wrong about who you are." Rebecca studied her mother-in-law's face, seeing genuine remorse for the first time. The proud, imperious woman who had entered the law office that morning had been completely humbled by her son's words from beyond the grave. "I was so angry," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "When David died, I was furious at the world, at God, at everyone who still had their children. And you were an easy target. You were young and beautiful and alive, and my son was gone. I resented that you got to keep living when he could." Marcus discreetly excused himself from the room, sensing that this conversation needed to happen privately between the two women who had both loved David most. "I convinced myself that you must have had ulterior motives," Eleanor went on, "because the alternative was admitting that David had found genuine love, and I was jealous that he'd chosen you over his family, that he'd shared intimate moments with you that he'd never shared with me. I was losing my little boy, and instead of celebrating the woman who made him happy, I tried to destroy her." Rebecca felt her anger softening, replaced by a deep sadness for all the time they'd lost. "Mrs. Blackwood," "Eleanor, please," the older woman interrupted, "and I need to tell you something else, something that makes my behavior even more inexcusable." Rebecca waited, unsure what else could possibly be revealed after everything she'd already learned. "I knew about David's inheritance," Eleanor said quietly. "I've known for years. When James Rodriguez died, his family's lawyers contacted me about David's inheritance. I chose not to tell David about it when he was younger, because I wanted him to have a normal childhood, not to be burdened by that kind of wealth." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You knew?" "I knew, and when David turned 18 and started receiving the legal notices, I intercepted some of them. I was afraid the money would change him, make him a target for the wrong kind of people. I thought I was protecting him." Eleanor's voice broke again. "I had no idea he'd found out anyway, and made his own decisions about how to handle it." The irony was devastating. Eleanor had spent months accusing Rebecca of being a gold digger when she herself had been the one trying to control and hide David's wealth. "The worst part," Eleanor continued, "is that David tried to tell me about you. He called me after your second date, so excited, talking about this amazing nurse he'd met who made him laugh. He said you didn't care about his uniform or his family name, that you just saw him as David, and I dismissed it. I told him to be careful, that women would try to take advantage of him." Rebecca remembered David mentioning that his mother had seemed worried about their relationship, but he'd never told her the specifics of their conversation. "I poisoned his mind against sharing things with me," Eleanor said. "I made him feel like he couldn't trust me with the truth about his feelings, his money, his choices. So he stopped trying, and I lost my son long before he died." The weight of Eleanor's regret filled the room. Rebecca could see the older woman was carrying guilt that went far beyond their recent conflict. "But you know what the most shameful part is?" Eleanor asked, finally meeting Rebecca's eyes directly. "Even after reading that letter, part of me is still jealous. Because David trusted you with his heart in a way he never trusted me, because he knew you would love him for who he was, and he wasn't sure I would." Rebecca felt tears starting again, but this time they were tears of compassion rather than hurt. "Eleanor, David loved you so much. He used to tell me stories about his childhood, about how you would read to him when he was sick, how you taught him to be a gentleman. He was proud to be your son. Then why did he hide so much from me?" "Because he knew you worried about him," Rebecca said gently. "He told me once that you'd been through so much, losing his biological father, raising him alone for those years, then blending your family when you remarried. He said you deserved to see him as successful and independent, not as someone who needed to rely on inherited money." Eleanor closed her eyes, processing this new perspective on her son's motivations. "There's something else," Rebecca said softly. "David was planning to tell you about the inheritance after we'd been married for a year. He wanted to prove to you that our marriage was solid, that I wasn't going anywhere, before he revealed the family financial situation. He was going to ask for your help in deciding how to use the money for good causes. He had notebooks full of ideas. Scholarships for military families, funding for veteran mental health programs, support for families of fallen soldiers. He wanted to honor his biological father's memory while building something meaningful, and he wanted your guidance on how to do it properly. Eleanor broke down completely then, sobbing with the full weight of everything she'd lost through her own assumptions and fears. Rebecca got up from her chair and moved around the table, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. We both lost him, Rebecca said, echoing her earlier words. But we don't have to lose each other. David wanted us to be family. Eleanor looked up at her daughter-in-law through her tears. Can you ever forgive me, after everything I've said and done? Rebecca thought about David's letter, about his hope that the two women he loved most could find a way to love each other. She thought about the lonely months she'd spent grieving without family support, and about Eleanor's obvious pain and regret. I forgive you, Rebecca said simply, and I hope you can help me figure out how to honor David's memory with this inheritance. I have no idea how to handle that kind of responsibility. Eleanor reached up and squeezed Rebecca's hand. I'd be honored to help. We'll do it together, the way David would have wanted. As Marcus Patterson returned to the conference room, he found not two adversaries, but two grieving women who had finally found their way to each other through love, truth, and the enduring wisdom of the man they'd both lost. The gold digger accusations had been buried forever, replaced by the beginning of a real family bond forged in forgiveness and mutual respect. 6 months after that life-changing afternoon in Marcus Patterson's conference room, Rebecca stood in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Seattle, watching as 200 military families gathered for the inaugural David Rodriguez-Blackwood Memorial Scholarship Dinner. The event was everything David would have wanted: elegant but not ostentatious, meaningful rather than merely social, and focused entirely on supporting the people he'd dedicated his life to serving. Eleanor approached, resplendent in a navy blue gown that complemented Rebecca's simple black dress. The transformation in their relationship had been one of the most unexpected blessings to emerge from Rebecca's grief. What had started as a tentative truce in the lawyer's office had blossomed into a genuine mother-daughter bond that neither woman had expected but both desperately needed. The photographer from the Seattle Times wants to speak with you, Eleanor said, placing a gentle hand on Rebecca's arm. Are you ready for this? Rebecca nodded, though she still felt overwhelmed by the attention their story had generated. Word had somehow leaked about the dramatic will reading, and the media had latched onto the gold digger vindication angle. While Rebecca found the publicity uncomfortable, she'd learned to use it as a platform to honor David's memory and promote the causes he'd cared about. Mrs. Rodriguez-Blackwood, a young reporter approached with a warm smile. I'm Jennifer Chen from the Times. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us about tonight's event. Rebecca had legally changed her name back to include both her maiden name and David's biological surname, wanting to honor both his chosen family and his heritage. It felt like the right way to carry his memory forward. Of course, Rebecca replied. David would be so proud to see how many people have come together tonight to support military families. Can you tell us about the scholarship program you've established? Rebecca's eyes lit up as she described their plan. We're providing full college scholarships for children of fallen service members, plus additional support for military spouses pursuing nursing degrees, something that was particularly close to David's heart. We're also funding mental health resources for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. What Rebecca didn't mention was how Eleanor had become her closest collaborator in these efforts. The older woman's decades of experience with charitable organizations had proved invaluable, and her social connections had opened doors that Rebecca never could have accessed alone. More importantly, working together on David's legacy had given them a shared purpose that transcended their past conflicts. I understand there was some initial family opposition to your inheritance, the reporter asked, delicately. Eleanor stepped forward before Rebecca could answer. I made terrible mistakes in my grief, she said firmly. I let my pain cloud my judgment about the woman my son loved. Rebecca has shown incredible grace in forgiving me and allowing me to be part of honoring David's memory. The reporter looked surprised by Eleanor's candid admission, but Rebecca simply squeezed her mother-in-law's hand. They'd agreed early on to be honest about their journey, believing that their story of reconciliation might help other families navigate similar conflict. As the evening progressed, Rebecca found herself in conversation with Maria Santos, a young widow whose husband had been killed in Afghanistan just 3 months earlier. Maria held her 2-year-old daughter while trying to keep her 4-year-old son from running between the elegantly dressed guests. "I don't know how you do it," Maria said quietly, "how you keep going, how you make his death mean something." Rebecca knelt down to the little boy's level, remembering her own desperate search for meaning in those first awful months after David's death. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said gently. "Just focus on taking care of yourself and your baby. The rest will come when you're ready." "But what if I'm never ready? What if I can't be strong enough?" "You're already stronger than you know," Rebecca replied. "You're here tonight, you're taking care of your children, you're still standing. That's enough for now." Eleanor appeared beside them, and Rebecca watched as her mother-in-law's natural maternal instincts kicked in. Within minutes, she'd arranged for the children to be entertained by hotel staff, while Maria could enjoy dinner in peace. It was these small moments of kindness that had shown Rebecca who Eleanor really was beneath her sometimes intimidating exterior. Later, as Rebecca delivered her keynote speech, she looked out at the audience, and saw faces that reminded her why David's sacrifice had mattered. There were young soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave, experienced veterans carrying visible and invisible wounds, families struggling to rebuild their lives after loss, and community members who simply wanted to support those who served. David Rodriguez-Blackwood lived by a simple principle, Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. He believed that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on other people's lives. He chose to live modestly not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He saved his inheritance not for luxury but for legacy. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Tonight we're not just honoring David's memory, we're continuing his mission. Every scholarship we award, every family we support, every veteran we help transition back to civilian life, is a testament to the values he died defending. We're proving that love multiplies when you share it, that wealth means nothing unless it's used to lift others up. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she continued. David's biological father, Captain James Rodriguez, died serving his country when David was just 3 years old. David never got to know him, but he inherited more than money from Captain Rodriguez. He inherited a legacy of service, sacrifice, and commitment to something greater than himself. She paused, looking directly at Eleanor, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Family isn't always about blood or last names or shared DNA. Sometimes family is about choosing to love each other despite our differences, choosing to forgive each other's mistakes, and choosing to build something beautiful together from the broken pieces of our grief. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was thinking about David, about how proud he would be to see his inheritance being used exactly as he'd dreamed, and about how 2 broken women had found healing by choosing love over resentment. As the evening wound down, Rebecca and Eleanor stood together on the hotel's terrace, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time since David's death, Rebecca felt genuinely hopeful about the future. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For what?" "For showing me who my son really was, for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it, for letting me be part of this." Rebecca smiled, thinking about the family she'd gained through loss and the legacy they were building together. "Thank you for being the mother David always said you were, protective, loving, and willing to fight for what matters." The gold digger had become the guardian of a fortune built on love, service, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. 3 years after the Scholarship Foundation's launch, Rebecca was sorting through boxes in the Blackwood family estate's attic when she made a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about David's story. Eleanor had finally decided to downsize from the sprawling Bellevue mansion, and they'd been spending weekends together going through decades of accumulated family memories. "Rebecca, dear, did you find those photo albums I mentioned?" Eleanor called from downstairs, her voice echoing through the grand foyer that had once intimidated Rebecca, but now felt like home. "Not yet," Rebecca called back, pulling another dusty box toward her. "But I found something else interesting." The box was labeled, "David Military Documents," in Eleanor's precise handwriting. But as Rebecca opened it, she realized it contained much more than military paperwork. Underneath David's deployment records and commendation letters, she found a manila envelope marked Confidential D. Rodriguez Estate. Inside were documents that made Rebecca sink onto an old trunk in stunned silence. Legal papers, bank statements, and correspondence dating back to when David was 18 revealed a truth that neither she nor Eleanor had known. David's inheritance hadn't just been $47 million. It had been over $200 million. The papers told an incredible story. Captain James Rodriguez hadn't just come from a wealthy Texas family. He'd been the sole heir to Rodriguez Energy, one of the largest privately held oil companies in the Southwest. When James died, the company had been sold, and the proceeds placed in trust for David. But David had taken only a fraction of his inheritance, leaving the rest to accumulate interest for nearly a decade. Rebecca's hands trembled as she read David's handwritten notes in the margins of the document. He'd been planning something enormous, not just scholarships for military families, but an entire network of support systems. Medical centers for veteran care, job training programs, housing assistance, mental health facility. He'd mapped out a comprehensive plan to address every challenge facing modern military families. "Eleanor," Rebecca called, her voice urgent. "You need to see that." Eleanor climbed the narrow attic stairs, moving more slowly than she once had, but with the determined grace of a woman who'd found new purpose in her later years. "What is it, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Rebecca said, holding up the document. "David left us more than we knew, much more." As Eleanor read through the papers, her face went through a series of expressions: shock, amazement, and finally a deep sadness mixed with pride. $200 million, she whispered. He was planning to change the world. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a detailed outline in David's handwriting. He wanted to build residential facilities where military families could stay, while their loved ones received treatment at VA hospital. He'd researched the housing crisis for military families, the long waiting lists for mental health services, the employment challenges for veterans. Eleanor sat down heavily on an old chair, still processing the magnitude of David's vision. He never said a word about any of this. Because he was still planning, Rebecca realized. Look at the dates on these notes. He was working on this right up until his final deployment. He was going to come home and tell us everything. The discovery recontextualized everything they thought they knew about David's last year. His careful questions about Rebecca's work at the hospital, his conversations with veterans at the base, his sudden interest in Eleanor's charity work. He'd been gathering information for his grand plan. "There's more," Rebecca said, pulling out a thick folder. He'd already started preliminary negotiations to purchase land in 5 different states. Medical facilities, transitional housing, job training centers. He was building an empire of support. Eleanor wiped away tears as she read David's notes about wanting to honor both his biological father's memory and his adoptive father's value. He'd written extensively about how Captain Rodriguez's sacrifice had given him opportunities, and how he wanted to ensure other military children had the same chances. "What do we do with this?" Eleanor asked quietly. "This is so much bigger than what we've been doing." Rebecca thought about the past 3 years, about the hundreds of families they'd already helped through the scholarship program. It had been deeply meaningful work, but compared to David's vision, they'd barely scratched the surface of what was possible. "We honor his plan," Rebecca said, firmly. "We build what he dreamed of building." "But Rebecca, this kind of undertaking, it's massive. We're talking about establishing medical centers, building residential facilities, creating a nationwide network. Do we even know how to do something like this?" Rebecca smiled, thinking about how far they'd both come since that awful day in the lawyer's office. 3 years ago, I didn't know how to run a scholarship foundation either. You taught me, we learned together. Eleanor nodded slowly, her business-minded brain already working through the logistics. "We'd need architects, medical consultants, government liaisons, construction managers, and we'd need to do it right," Rebecca added. David was meticulous about research. Look at these feasibility studies he commissioned, the demographic analyses, the partnership proposals with existing VA facilities. As they continued reading through David's papers, a fuller picture of his character emerged. He hadn't just inherited wealth, he'd inherited a sense of responsibility that went far beyond what either woman had understood. His decision to live modestly and serve in the military wasn't just about proving himself, it was about understanding the real needs of the people he wanted to help. He was going to call it the Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation for Military Families. Eleanor read from a draft charter, honoring both his biological father and his adoptive family. Rebecca felt goosebumps as she read David's mission statement. No military family should face their challenges alone, no veteran should struggle without support, no child should go without opportunities, because their parent paid the ultimate price for freedom. There's something else, Eleanor said, pulling out a sealed letter marked for Rebecca and Mom, to be opened when you're ready to dream big. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. They'd thought David's previous letter had revealed everything, but apparently, he'd been keeping his biggest dreams for when they were strong enough to handle them. Should we? As Rebecca carefully opened the letter, she realized that their journey of discovery was far from over. David had been planning not just to provide for his wife and honor his family, but to create a lasting legacy that would support military families for generations to come. The gold digger who'd inherited a fortune was about to discover that the fortune was just the beginning of the story. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the thick letter, David's familiar handwriting filling several pages of personal station. Eleanor moved her chair closer, and together they began to read the words of a man who had somehow anticipated their journey from conflict to collaboration. My dearest Rebecca and Mom, the letter began, if you're reading this together, it means something beautiful has happened. It means you've found your way to each other despite the pain of losing me. It means you've discovered that love really can triumph over grief, and that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice. Eleanor reached for Rebecca's free hand, squeezing it gently as they continued reading. I hope you've forgiven each other for whatever harsh words were spoken in those first dark days after my death. Mom, I know you'll blame yourself for not being the mother you think I deserved, but you were exactly the mother I needed. You taught me to be strong, to value tradition, and to never settle for less than I was capable of achieving. Tears were already flowing down Eleanor's cheeks, but she gestured for Rebecca to keep reading. Rebecca, my beloved wife, I know my mother probably said terrible things about you. She does that when she's afraid. She attacks what she doesn't understand. But I also know your heart, and I know you'll find a way to see past her fear to the love underneath. You have the gift of seeing people's true selves, even when they're hiding behind walls of pain. Rebecca paused, thinking about how accurately David had predicted their journey. Even in death, he'd understood them both better than they'd understood themselves. By now you've probably discovered my real inheritance, and the plans I was making. I'm sorry I kept so much from both of you, but I needed time to figure out how to do this right. Growing up wealthy taught me that money can be a blessing or a curse depending on how you use it. I wanted to make sure I used it to build something lasting, something that would honor the sacrifices of people like my biological father. The letter went on to detail David's research process, how he'd spent months interviewing military families, consulting with VA administrators, and studying successful charitable organizations. He'd been building a comprehensive understanding of the challenges facing modern military families, from deployment stress to reintegration difficulties, to the unique needs of Gold Star families. I met a 12-year-old girl named Sarah whose father died in my unit. David had written. She was brilliant. Straight A's, dreams of becoming a doctor, but her family couldn't afford to send her to college. I met a veteran named Marcus, who was living in his car because he couldn't navigate the bureaucracy to get his disability benefit. I met a military wife named Jennifer who was working 3 jobs to support her kids while her husband was deployed, and she was still falling behind on rent. Rebecca remembered David mentioning some of these people, but she hadn't realized he was documenting their stories as part of a larger plan. Every story broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. I realized that my inheritance wasn't just money, it was an opportunity to make sure no military family ever faces these challenges alone. But I also realized I couldn't do it by myself. I needed people I trusted, people who understood sacrifice and service, and what it means to put others first. Eleanor looked up from the letter. He was planning to ask us to help him. He was planning to ask us to lead it. Rebecca corrected, pointing to the next paragraph. Mom, I need your expertise with large-scale charitable work, your connections in the business community, and your gift for organization. Rebecca, I need your medical knowledge, your understanding of what families go through during health crises, and your natural compassion for people who are struggling. Together, you two could build something I never could have built alone. The letter outlined David's complete vision, a network of Rodriguez-Blackwood centers in 25 cities across the United States. Each center would include medical facilities specializing in military-related health issues, temporary housing for military families during medical crises, job training programs for veterans, educational support for military children, and counseling services for families dealing with deployment stress or loss. I've already secured preliminary agreements for land in Dallas, San Antonio, Norfolk, San Diego, and Colorado Springs. David had written. The architectural plans are in the filing cabinet in my home office. Yes, Rebecca, the one you've never opened because you thought it was just old deployment paperwork. Rebecca gasped. I thought those were just his military files. I couldn't bear to go through them. The total cost for the first 5 centers will be approximately $60 million. The letter continued. The remaining funds should be invested to ensure the centers can operate indefinitely without relying on outside donations. I've included detailed financial projections and operational plans. Eleanor shook her head in amazement. He thought of everything. Not everything. Rebecca said, reading ahead. Listen to this. The one thing I couldn't plan for was how to make sure you two would work together instead of against each other. I'm hoping that grief will eventually give way to understanding, and that understanding will grow into love. You're the 2 strongest women I've ever known, but you're strong in different ways. Together, you could move mountains. The letter concluded with specific instructions for implementing David's plan, including contact information for the lawyers, architects, and consultants he'd already engaged. But the final paragraph was purely personal. I wish I could be there to see what you build together. I wish I could see Mom teaching Rebecca about high-level philanthropy, and Rebecca teaching Mom about the real day-to-day struggles of military family. I wish I could see you both laughing together over some inside joke or crying together when you help a family in crisis, but mostly I wish I could see you both happy again, finding purpose in helping others the way you both helped me become the man I was meant to be. The letter was signed simply, All my love, David. Rebecca and Eleanor sat in silence for several minutes, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what David was asking them to undertake. Building a national network of support centers would be the work of years, possibly decades. It would require expertise they didn't have, connections they'd need to build, and a level of collaboration that would test even their newfound bond. It's impossible, Eleanor said finally. It's too big, too complex, too ambitious. Rebecca looked at her mother-in-law, thinking about everything they'd already accomplished together in 3 years. You know what else seemed impossible? You and I sitting in the same room, without arguing. Me inheriting $47 million I never knew existed. Us building a scholarship program that's already changed hundreds of lives. Eleanor smiled through her tears. You're right, we've already done several impossible things. Besides, Rebecca added, we don't have to do it all at once. David's plan is for 25 centers, but we could start with 1. We could learn as we go, the way we did with the scholarship program. Eleanor stood up, her businessman's mind already working through the logistics. We'd need to visit the sites he selected, meet with his consultants, review the architectural plans. We'd need to figure out how to honor his vision while making it our own. Rebecca agreed. As they gathered up David's papers, both women felt the weight of the responsibility he'd entrusted to them, but for the first time since his death, they also felt excitement about the future, not just for themselves, but for the thousands of military families who would benefit from David's dream made real 5 years later. Rebecca stood at the podium of the grand opening ceremony for the 5th Rodriguez-Blackwood Center, this one located in Norfolk, Virginia, near one of the largest naval bases in the country. The gleaming modern facility behind her represented everything David had dreamed of, a comprehensive support center where military families could find medical care, temporary housing, job training, educational support and counseling services all under one roof. The crowd gathered on the lawn included military families, local officials, medical professionals and volunteers who had made this moment possible. But Rebecca's eyes kept finding the woman in the front row, Eleanor, now 78 but still elegant and formidable, wearing a navy blue dress with a small pin on her lapel shaped like David's military insignia. When my husband David first shared his vision with me through letters he left behind, Rebecca began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, I thought it was impossible. The scope was too big, the logistics too complex, the financial requirements too overwhelming. But David knew something I didn't know yet. He knew that impossible things become possible when people who love each other work together toward a common purpose. In the 5 years since discovering David's complete plan, Rebecca and Eleanor had become an unstoppable team. Eleanor's business acumen and social connections had opened doors that Rebecca never could have accessed alone, while Rebecca's medical background and genuine empathy had ensured that every center was designed around real family needs, rather than bureaucratic convenience. The first center in Dallas had taken 3 years to plan and build, with countless mistakes and learning opportunities along the way. Rebecca remembered the heated arguments with architects who didn't understand why they needed soundproof family meeting rooms, or Eleanor's frustration with contractors who couldn't grasp the urgency of their timeline. But they'd learned to leverage each other's strengths, Eleanor handling the high-level negotiations and strategic planning, while Rebecca focused on operational details and family services. Each Rodriguez-Blackwood center serves approximately 800 military families per year, Rebecca continued, reading statistics that still amazed her. In our 5 operational centers, we've provided temporary housing for over 2,000 families during medical crises, helped 1,500 veterans find meaningful employment, and supported nearly 3,000 military children with educational assistance. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real impact. Rebecca thought about Maria Santos, the young widow she'd met at that first scholarship dinner, whose son was now thriving in college thanks to both educational support and the counseling services he'd received at the San Antonio Center. She thought about James Patterson, the veteran who'd been living in his car when they first met him, who now managed the job training program at the Colorado Springs Center, and had helped dozens of other veterans find both housing and purpose. The true measure of our success, Rebecca said, isn't in the buildings we've constructed, or the services we provide. It's in the families who no longer face their challenges alone. It's in the veterans who've found new careers and renewed hope. It's in the children who are growing up knowing that their parents' sacrifice was honored not just with words, but with action. Eleanor had been Rebecca's co-speaker at every center opening, but this time she'd asked Rebecca to deliver the remarks alone. You're the heart of this organization, Eleanor had said. People need to hear from you. But Rebecca could see Eleanor in the front row, nodding encouragingly, and she knew that every word she spoke represented both of their commitment to David's vision. I want to tell you about a letter I received last week, Rebecca said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It's from a 10-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, no relation to my husband's biological father, but the same last name that David chose to honor. Emma's father was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago, and her family has been staying at our Norfolk center, while her mother receives treatment for the PTSD she developed after becoming a Gold Star widow. Rebecca's voice grew softer as she read from the letter. Dear Ms. Rodriguez-Blackwood, thank you for building a place where my mom could get better. She smiles again now, and she says it's because people like you understand what it's like to lose someone in the war. I want to be a nurse like you when I grow up, so I can help other kids whose moms and dads are sad. The crowd was silent, many wiping away tears. Rebecca folded the letter carefully, and looked out at the faces in front of her. That little girl doesn't know that her letter represents exactly what my husband hoped to achieve. David believed that the greatest honor we could give to fallen service members was to ensure their families not only survived their loss, but thrived despite it. He believed that every military child should have the same opportunities he had, and that every veteran should be able to transition successfully to civilian life. Rebecca paused, thinking about how much her own life had changed since that terrible day in Marcus Patterson's conference room, when she'd first learned about her inheritance. 6 years ago, I was accused of being a gold digger who had married for money. The accusation was painful because it was so far from the truth. I had married for love, and I had no idea about the wealth that would eventually become my responsibility. But standing here today, I realize that in a way, my accuser was right about one thing. I did discover gold, not the gold of money or material wealth, but something far more precious. Eleanor's eyes were shining with tears and pride as Rebecca continued. I discovered the gold of purpose, the gold of family relationships forged through forgiveness and mutual respect, the gold of seeing impossibly big dreams become reality through persistence and collaboration. I discovered that true wealth isn't about what you inherit, it's about what you build with what you've been given. Rebecca gestured toward the Rodriguez-Blackwood Center behind her, its windows gleaming in the Virginia sunshine. This building and the 4 others like it represent more than David's inheritance put to good use. They represent the truth that love multiplies when you share it, that family bonds can be stronger than blood ties, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to live lives worthy of their sacrifice. As the crowd erupted in applause, Rebecca felt David's presence more strongly than she had since his death. She could almost hear his voice, proud and grateful, telling her that she and Eleanor had exceeded even his grandest hopes for what they could accomplish together. The gold digger had indeed found her treasure, not in money but in purpose, family, and the endless capacity of the human heart to transform grief into gifts for others. After the ceremony, as Rebecca and Eleanor walked through the center's gleaming halls, Eleanor slipped her arm through Rebecca's. "What do you think David would say if he could see this?" Rebecca smiled, thinking of her husband's letters, his careful planning and his unwavering faith in their ability to love each other and work together. "I think he'd say we're just getting started." 10 years after that life-changing day in Marcus Patterson's law office, Rebecca stood in the familiar mahogany-paneled conference room, but this time, she wasn't alone and vulnerable. Eleanor sat beside her, both women now in their element as they met with a new generation of lawyers, architects, and philanthropic advisors to plan the next phase of their foundation's expansion. The transformation in both their lives had been so complete that sometimes Rebecca had to remind herself that there was a time when Eleanor had called her a gold digger. Now, at 73, Rebecca had become one of the most respected philanthropists in the country, while Eleanor, approaching 80, had found a renewed sense of purpose that had added years to her life and sparked to her eyes. The Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation now operates 15 centers across the United States, announced Sarah Chen, their foundation's executive director, as she presented the annual report. "We've served over 12,000 military families, placed more than 3,000 veterans in meaningful employment, and provided educational support to nearly 5,000 military children." But for Rebecca, the numbers, while impressive, weren't what mattered most. What mattered were the stories like Marcus Williams, who'd gone from living in his car to becoming the director of veteran services at their Phoenix Center, or Jennifer Park, the military wife who'd been working 3 jobs when David first met her, and who now ran their family support programs in San Diego. "There's something else," Rebecca said, addressing the room full of advisors and staff members. "Eleanor and I have been discussing the next phase of David's vision." Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same mischievous energy that Rebecca had learned to recognize as a sign that her mother-in-law was about to surprise everyone. "We want to establish the Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation internationally," Eleanor announced, "starting with centers in countries where American military personnel have served, places like Germany, South Korea, and Japan, to support both American military families stationed overseas and local veterans from allied nations." The room erupted in excited murmur. Marcus Patterson, now retired but still serving as their chief legal advisor, shook his head in amazement. "David would be so proud," he said quietly. Rebecca thought about David often, but especially during moments like these when she felt his presence most strongly. She'd never remarried, though she'd had opportunities. The love she'd shared with David felt complete, and her life's work felt like an extension of their marriage rather than something separate from it. "There's also a personal announcement we wanted to share," Rebecca said, exchanging a meaningful look with Eleanor. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "Rebecca, over these 10 years, You've become the daughter I never. You've shown me what it means to love unconditionally, to forgive completely, and to build something meaningful from the ashes of grief. Rebecca felt tears starting as Eleanor opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald ring that had belonged to David's great-grandmother. This ring has been in the Blackwood family for 4 generations, Eleanor continued. But you've always been a true Blackwood, even when I was too blind to see it. I want you to have this as a symbol of your place in our family, not just as David's wife, but as my daughter. Rebecca accepted the ring with trembling hands, knowing that this moment represented the complete healing of wounds that had once seemed irreparable. The ring was beautiful, but what it represented was priceless. Acceptance, love, and the kind of family bond that transcends biology. There's one more thing, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. I've been doing some genealogy research, and I discovered something interesting about my own family. She pulled out a folder of documents that had taken months to compile. My great-grandfather, Carlos Martinez, served in World War II alongside a Captain William Blackwood, Eleanor's first husband, David's adoptive father. Eleanor gasped. You're joking. I'm not. They served in the same unit in the Pacific Theater. There are letters between them, photographs, even a commendation they received together for rescuing wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Rebecca spread the documents across the table. They were best friends, brothers in arms who saved each other's lives multiple times. Eleanor studied the faded photographs, tears streaming down her face. This means David and I were connected long before we ever met. Rebecca finished. Our families have been bound together by service and sacrifice for generations. David didn't just marry me. He brought our families back together. Marcus Patterson, who had seen many extraordinary moments in his legal career, wiped his own eyes as he examined the documents. The odds of this connection are astronomical, he said. It's as if David was meant to find you. Eleanor stood up and embraced Rebecca, holding her tightly. All those terrible things I said to you, she whispered. When your great-grandfather was a hero who saved my husband's life. The past is the past, Rebecca replied. What matters is who we've chosen to become. As the meeting concluded and the staff began filing out, Rebecca and Eleanor remained in the conference room, looking out at the Seattle skyline that had witnessed so much of their journey. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if David had lived? Rebecca considered the question carefully. I think about it sometimes, but then I realize that in a way he is still living through every family we help, every veteran we employ, every child whose education we support. His love didn't end when he died. It multiplied through everything we've built in his honor. Eleanor nodded, fingering the small pin on her lapel, David's military insignia that she wore to every Foundation event. I have a confession, Eleanor. That day in Marcus's office, when I called you a gold digger, part of me knew I was wrong even as I said it. I'd watched you with David, seen how you looked at him, how you cared for him during his illness, but I was so angry at losing him that I needed someone to blame. I know, Rebecca said simply. Grief makes us do things we never thought we were capable of, both terrible things and beautiful things. The beautiful things outweigh the terrible ones, don't they? Rebecca looked around the conference room where their journey had begun, thinking about the 15 centers now operating, the thousands of families they'd helped, the staff members who'd found their own purpose in serving others, and the mother-daughter relationship she'd gained through forgiveness. Yes, the beautiful things always outweigh the terrible ones, especially when we choose love over resentment. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Rebecca caught her reflection in the conference room's polished table. The young, grief-stricken widow who'd entered this room 10 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her purpose in helping others, and her family in the most unlikely place. The gold digger accusation had been the beginning of her real story, not the end of it. And what a story it had become, one of love, forgiveness, family, and the endless capacity of the human heart to create beauty from ash. David's inheritance had given her money, but David's love had given her everything else: purpose, family, and the knowledge that The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the day Catherine's lawsuit came to trial. Rebecca sat at the defendant's table with her legal team, but she felt strangely calm. The past 3 months of the Truth Campaign had transformed public opinion so dramatically that Catherine's lawyers had already attempted to settle twice, but Rebecca had refused both offers. "This isn't about money anymore," Rebecca had told Eleanor the night before. "This is about David's memory and ensuring that no one can ever again question the legitimacy of what we've built in his honor." Judge Margaret Chen, no relation to Rebecca, despite the shared surname, called the court to order. Catherine sat across the aisle looking less confident than she had when the lawsuit began. The media attention had not been kind to her, particularly after investigative journalists revealed that she had spent her own inheritance on luxury apartments in Paris and Monaco while her brother was serving in Afghanistan. Catherine's lead attorney, Richard Harrison, stood to present his opening argument. "Your Honor, this case is about a simple question. Did David Blackwood have the legal right to leave his entire inheritance to one person, excluding his siblings from their rightful share of the family estate?" But before Harrison could continue, something unprecedented happened. Rebecca's attorney, Janet Morrison, stood up. "Your Honor, before my colleague proceeds, I'd like to present new evidence that has come to light, evidence that completely changes the nature of this case." Judge Chen raised an eyebrow. "Proceed, Counselor." Janet approached the bench with a sealed envelope. "This is a letter written by David Rodriguez-Blackwood specifically to be opened only in the event that his will was contested or his wife's character was questioned. It was discovered by his longtime attorney Marcus Patterson, who has been serving as an executor of the estate." Catherine's face went pale as Janet read David's words aloud to the packed courtroom. "If this letter is being read, it means someone is questioning either my mental competency when I wrote my will, or Rebecca's worthiness to inherit my estate. To that person, I say this: you clearly never knew me at all." Rebecca felt David's presence in the courtroom as his words continued. "I left my inheritance to Rebecca, not because she was my wife, but because she was the only person I ever met who loved me despite my wealth, not because of. She is also the only person I trusted to use that wealth exactly as I would have used it to serve others, to honor sacrifice, and to build something lasting and meaningful." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Janet's voice reading David's letter. "To my sister Catherine, if you are the one bringing this challenge, you received your own inheritance from our grandfather's trust. You chose to spend it on yourself. I chose to leave mine to someone who would spend it on others. That's the difference between us, and it's why Rebecca deserved my trust and you don't." Catherine's attorney tried to object, but Judge Chen waved him silent. "Furthermore," the letter continued, "I want to address the inevitable accusation that Rebecca married me for money. The truth is the opposite. She almost refused to marry me when she learned about my family's wealth. She was terrified that people would think exactly what they're probably thinking now. She agreed to marry me only after I promised her that we would live on my military salary and that she would never have to deal with the burden of wealth while I was alive." Rebecca remembered that conversation clearly. David's promise that she could live as a soldier's wife, not an heiress, for as long as he lived. "I watched Rebecca during my final illness," David's letter went on. "I watched her spend her own savings on my care. I watched her work double shifts to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. I watched her research every possible option to save my life, never once asking about money or inheritance. She mortgaged her future to extend my life by even a few days. Does that sound like a gold digger to you?" The packed courtroom was completely silent. Several spectators were openly crying. "Finally, I want to say this. If you're still determined to take Rebecca to court after reading this letter, then look at what she's built with my inheritance. Look at the families she's helped, the veterans she's employed, the children she's educated. Look at the transparency with which she's operated, the personal sacrifices she's made, the life she's lived in service to others." Janet paused, letting David's words sink in before reading the final paragraph. "Rebecca Martinez-Rodriguez-Blackwood is the finest person I ever knew. She made me a better man, a better soldier, and a better human being. My inheritance was the luckiest thing that ever happened to her, but her love was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. Anyone who still wants to call her a gold digger after seeing her life's work doesn't understand what real gold looks like." As Janet finished reading, the courtroom erupted in applause, something Judge Chen should have stopped but chose not to. Catherine was staring at her hands, her face red with embarrassment and shame. But David's letter wasn't the only surprise of the day. Judge Chen announced that she had received a special brief from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The VA has submitted a statement to this court, Judge Chen announced, detailing the Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation's impact on veteran services nationwide. According to the VA's analysis, the foundation has saved the federal government an estimated $43 million in veteran care costs, while providing superior services to military families. The judge continued reading from the VA brief. The Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation has become the gold standard for private military family support. Their innovative programs have been adopted by other organizations nationwide, multiplying their impact far beyond their direct service. In the professional opinion of the Department of Veterans Affairs, David Rodriguez-Blackwood's inheritance could not have been put to better use. Catherine's attorney made a final desperate attempt to salvage the case. Your Honor, regardless of these emotional appeals, the legal question remains, does one spouse have the right to inherit an entire estate to the exclusion of siblings? Judge Chen's response was swift and definitive. Ms. Harrison, your client is not challenging the legal validity of the will that was established 12 years ago when the estate was settled. She's challenging the character and motives of the inheritor. This court has now heard overwhelming evidence of Ms. Rodriguez-Blackwood's character, including testimony from her late husband, endorsements from military leadership, and documentation of her exemplary use of the inheritance. The judge paused, looking directly at Catherine. This lawsuit appears to be motivated not by legitimate legal concerns, but by greed and jealousy. Case dismissed. The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause. Rebecca felt Eleanor's hand squeeze hers as reporters rushed to capture the moment of complete vindication. As they left the courthouse, Catherine approached Rebecca for the first time in over a decade. "I'm sorry," Catherine said quietly, her voice barely audible over the celebrating crowd. "David was right about you and I was wrong about everything." Rebecca looked at her sister-in-law, really looked at her, and saw not an enemy but a grieving sister who had lost her way. "We all grieve differently," Rebecca said gently. "David's memory is big enough for all of us to honor in our own way." Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked away into the crowd. Rebecca had been called a gold digger one final time, and this time the entire country had witnessed her vindication. The truth about her character, her motives and her life's work was now part of the public record, preserved forever in David's own words and validated by the highest levels of government and military leadership. The accusations that had once broken her heart had ultimately led to the greatest validation of her life's work. 6 months after the courtroom victory, Rebecca stood on the stage of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., accepting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. The award citation read, "For extraordinary dedication to military families and veterans, demonstrating the highest ideals of service, sacrifice and compassion." President Martinez spoke to the gathered audience of military leaders, politicians and dignitaries. Rebecca Rodriguez-Blackwood has transformed personal grief into national service, turning one man's inheritance into a legacy that has touched thousands of American families. She exemplifies the very best of American values, that true wealth is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute to others. Eleanor watched from the front row, tears streaming down her face as she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 15 years earlier, she had called Rebecca a gold digger in a lawyer's office. Now she was watching her daughter-in-law receive the nation's highest civilian honor for her philanthropic work. After the ceremony, Rebecca found a quiet moment with Eleanor in the Kennedy Center's garden. "David would be so proud," Eleanor said, adjusting the medal around Rebecca's neck, "not just of the award, but of everything you've become." Rebecca smiled, thinking about how often she still felt David's presence in moments like these. He knew this would happen, didn't he? Even that final letter in court, he somehow predicted every challenge we'd face. "He knew your heart," Eleanor replied. "He knew that if he gave you the tools and the opportunity, you'd build something extraordinary. He just didn't know how extraordinary." The Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation had indeed grown beyond even David's ambitious vision. 22 centers now operated across the United States, with international expansion planned for the following year. The foundation had served over 25,000 military families, employed more than 4,000 veterans, and provided educational support to over 8,000 military children. But the numbers, impressive as they were, only told part of the story. The foundation had also inspired a movement. Other wealthy individuals had begun adopting Rebecca's transparency model for their charitable giving. Congress had passed the Rodriguez-Blackwood Act, providing federal funding for military family support centers. Based on the foundation's successful model, universities were offering degrees in military family social work, using curriculum developed by the foundation's research team. "There's something I need to tell you," Eleanor said as they walked through the garden. "Something I've been keeping to myself for the past year." Rebecca looked at her mother-in-law with concern. At 83, Eleanor was still sharp and active, but Rebecca worried constantly about her health. "I've been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's," Eleanor said quietly. "It's progressing slowly, but the doctors say I have maybe 2 or 3 good years left before it really takes hold." Rebecca stopped walking, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Eleanor had become more than a mother-in-law. She was Rebecca's closest friend, her most trusted advisor, and the only family she had left. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Rebecca asked, fighting back tears. "Because I wanted to make sure the foundation was secure first," Eleanor replied. "I wanted to see you receive the recognition you deserved. I wanted to know that David's legacy was in the right hands, not just legally, but practically." They sat down on a bench surrounded by blooming cherry trees, the Washington Monument visible in the distance. "I've been working with our legal team to establish a succession plan," Eleanor continued. "Maria Santos will take over as executive director when I can no longer serve on the board. She understands the foundation's mission because she lived it as a beneficiary before joining the staff." Rebecca nodded, thinking about how perfect that choice was. Maria had grown from a young widow struggling to survive into one of the foundation's most effective leaders. "And I've set up a personal trust to ensure that you're taken care of as you age," Eleanor added. "You've spent 15 years giving away David's inheritance to help others. I want to make sure you have security in your later years." "Eleanor, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Eleanor interrupted. "You've been my daughter for 15 years. You've given me purpose, meaning, and a reason to be proud of my life's work. You've shown me what it means to love unconditionally and serve selflessly. This is what mothers do for their daughters." Rebecca embraced Eleanor tightly, both women crying as they held each other in the shadow of the nation's capital. "I have one more request," Eleanor said when they separated. "I want to visit every Rodriguez-Blackwood center one more time while I'm still myself. I want to see what we built together, meet the families we've helped, and say goodbye to the work that gave my life meaning." Over the next 6 months, Rebecca and Eleanor embarked on what they privately called their victory tour. They visited all 22 centers, meeting with staff, families, and veterans whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. At each stop, Eleanor shared stories about the center's development, the challenges they'd overcome, and the lives they'd changed. The tour became a celebration not just of the foundation's impact, but of the relationship between two women who had found family in the most unlikely circumstance. Local media covered their visits, and their story continued to inspire people across the country. At the final stop, the original Dallas Center where their expansion had begun, Eleanor made an announcement that surprised even Rebecca. "This center will be renamed the David and Eleanor Rodriguez-Blackwood Center for Military Families," Eleanor said to the gathered crowd. "Not because I want my name on a building, but because I want future generations to know that real families aren't always born. Sometimes they're built through love, forgiveness, and shared purpose." Rebecca was overwhelmed by the gesture, but Eleanor wasn't finished. Rebecca Rodriguez-Blackwood took an inheritance she never wanted and turned it into a legacy that will outlast all of us, Eleanor continued. She was called a gold digger by people who didn't understand that the only gold she was ever interested in was the golden opportunity to honor her husband's memory by serving others. The crowd erupted in applause, but Rebecca was focused on Eleanor's words, hearing in them the complete transformation of their relationship from its bitter beginning to this moment of absolute love and respect. That evening, as they sat in David's childhood bedroom in the Blackwood family home, Eleanor made one final revelation. "I have something for you," she said, pulling out a small worn leather journal, David's diary from his final deployment. I found it in his personal effects but never gave it to you because I was jealous of what it might contain. Rebecca opened the journal with trembling hands, reading entry after entry about David's love for her, his plans for their future and his dreams for how his inheritance might help other military families. But it was the final entry, written just days before his death, that brought her to tears. Rebecca doesn't know about the money yet and I'm not sure how to tell her. She'll be overwhelmed by the responsibility, worried about people's motives for being around her, scared that she's not worthy of such trust, but she is worthy. She's the most worthy person I've ever known. If something happens to me, I hope she'll find a way to use the inheritance to help others, and I hope my family will love her the way I do because she deserves all the love in the world. 15 years after David's death, Rebecca finally understood the complete picture of his faith in her, his love for his family, and his vision for how wealth could be transformed into service. The gold digger had become the guardian of a legacy that would outlive them all. 5 years later, Rebecca stood in the memorial garden she had created behind the Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation headquarters, surrounded by 27 white marble stones, each one engraved with the name of a foundation center and the number of families it had served. Eleanor's name graced the 28th stone, marking not a center but the woman who had transformed from Rebecca's greatest adversary into her most cherished family. Eleanor had passed peacefully 6 months earlier, her final words to Rebecca being, "Tell David we kept our promise. We loved each other like he knew we could." Now at 53, Rebecca found herself reflecting on a journey that had taken her from a grief-stricken young widow accused of being a gold digger to the leader of one of America's most respected charitable organizations. But the transformation wasn't just professional, it was profoundly personal. The morning mail brought a letter that would provide the perfect capstone to her extraordinary story. It was from Catherine Blackwood Harrison, David's sister, who had tried to destroy the foundation 5 years earlier. "Dear Rebecca," the letter began, "I'm writing to tell you about something that happened yesterday that made me finally understand what David saw in you and what I was too blind to see myself." Rebecca continued reading with growing amazement. "I was in a coffee shop in Seattle when I overheard 2 young military wives talking about their struggles. One of them mentioned that her husband had been injured overseas, and they were facing medical bills they couldn't afford. The other wife immediately said, 'You need to contact the Rodriguez-Blackwood Foundation. They saved my family's life when we were in the same situation.'" Catherine's letter went on to describe how she had listened to these women share stories about the foundation's impact, not knowing that one of the people they were discussing was sitting just feet away. "But here's what made me cry," Rebecca, the second woman said. "The woman who runs that foundation, Rebecca Rodriguez-Blackwood, she's not like other rich people, she actually cares. When my son was in the hospital, she came to visit him personally. She sat with me in the waiting room and held my hand while he was in surgery. Rebecca felt tears starting as she read Catherine's words. "I realized that these women were talking about my brother's wife the way people used to talk about Mother Teresa, not as a wealthy philanthropist doing charity work, but as a genuinely good person who happens to have resources to help others, and I understood, finally, why David left you everything. It wasn't about the money, it was about your heart." The letter concluded with an invitation that took Rebecca's breath away. "I've spent the last 5 years rebuilding my life and examining my values. I've been volunteering with veterans organizations in Europe, trying to honor David's memory in my own way. I'm ready to come home now, and I'm hoping you might let me volunteer with the foundation, not for money or recognition, but because I want to be part of what you and David built together." As Rebecca finished reading, she realized that Catherine's transformation represented the ultimate validation of everything she and Eleanor had worked to achieve. They hadn't just built a foundation, they had created a legacy that changed hearts and inspired others to serve. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received a call from the White House. President Martinez wanted to nominate her for a special presidential commission on veteran services, and she was being considered for the Congressional Medal of Honor, an unprecedented recognition for a civilian. But neither the accolades nor the recognition mattered as much as the letter she found waiting on her desk when she returned from her meetings. It was from 16-year-old Emma Rodriguez. The little girl whose letter about her mother's PTSD treatment had moved Rebecca to tears years earlier. Dear Mrs. Rodriguez-Blackwood, Emma wrote, I'm writing to tell you that I just got accepted to nursing school with a Rodriguez-Blackwood scholarship, but more importantly, I want you to know that you saved more than my mom's life when you helped our family. You showed me what it means to turn pain into purpose. Emma's letter continued, my mom told me the story about how people used to call you a gold digger because you married Mr. David for money. She said that was the stupidest thing anyone ever said, because you're the opposite of someone who takes gold, you're someone who gives it away. She said you're proof that real treasure isn't what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Rebecca sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of a teenager who understood something that had taken the adult world years to recognize. As the sun set over Seattle, Rebecca made her way to David's portrait that hung in the Foundation's main conference room. She spoke to him often, sharing the day's victories and challenges, but tonight felt different. They don't call me a gold digger anymore, David, she said softly. Now they call me other things, philanthropist, humanitarian, leader. But I think you'd like what Emma Rodriguez called me best, someone who gives gold away. She paused, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. I understand now what you were really leaving me. It wasn't just money, it was the opportunity to discover who I really was. You knew that wealth would either corrupt me, or reveal my true character. You bet everything on my character, and somehow you were right. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began typing a message to Catherine. Welcome home. The Foundation would be honored to have you join our family. David would be proud to see his sister serving others in his memory. As she prepared to leave the office, Rebecca caught her reflection in the conference room's polished table, the same kind of table where her journey had begun 15 years earlier in Marcus Patterson's law office. The frightened, grief-stricken young woman, who had been accused of marrying for money, was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the greatest wealth isn't what you inherit, but what you create with your life. The final irony wasn't lost on her. She had been accused of being a gold digger, and in a way her accusers had been right. She had found gold, just not the kind they meant. She had discovered that real gold was hidden in service to others, in love that transcends blood relations, in forgiveness that heals old wounds, and in the transformation of personal grief into collective hope. David's inheritance had been $47 million, but Rebecca's true inheritance was far more valuable, the knowledge that love multiplies when you give it away, that family is built through choice as much as birth, and that the measure of a life well lived isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute. Eleanor had been wrong about Rebecca being a gold digger, but she had been absolutely right about one thing: Rebecca was pure gold, the kind that gets more valuable the more you share it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.